the authorities. So when it comes to an actual war, as we all call it a war, that is what it is. It is no surprise that the authorities would be attempting to clamp down even further on free expression.
Okay, my first statement, my opening statement for this morning regarding South Africa's stance of neutrality as far as this escalating horrendous war is concerned. Um, how do we as South Africans respond? Because we've been having lots of opposing views to this, lots of people calling Cyril Ramaphosa very a lame duck on this issue.
Yeah, it's a tough one because we know that it seems like there is already a split in the government itself, right? Because our South Africa's initial response, which we believe was basically authored by Naledi Pandor, the head of international relations, was to condemn Russia, to say Russia must pull their troops out. Next thing we know, Cyril Ramaphosa is making very much more kind of moderate statements, not criticizing Russia. And then, of course, it all ends at the United Nations end of last week, where there's a resolution to criticize Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and South Africa decides to abstain and is one of only a handful of countries in the world to do that. There are 25 other African countries that voted to criticize Putin. So it's not as if we're in very large company here. It was a very noticeable stance, and one that has been observed all over the world. And a lot of international observers have asked, what is South Africa doing? Why on earth wouldn't you criticize Russia when it comes to this? And that's the question that deserves exploring. If you think that we are supporting Russia on economic grounds because they're a big trade partner, for instance, that is simply not true. Russia is not even in South Africa's top 14 trade partners, which is headed by China and the US and Germany and the UK. It also is not the case that Russia is giving us so much foreign investment. In fact, South Africa has more investment in Russia than Russia has in South Africa. And Russia also doesn't give us aid, development aid, in the way that many countries in the West do. So there simply is not an economic reason for why we should be so determined to keep Russia on side.
Okay, so obviously there's a reason for why. We need to understand what those reasons are for South Africa to keep Russia sweet. Let's look at the foreign policy issue, because as you've just indicated, it's not as if they're investing heavily in our country. We also know, as you have just indicated, that Russia does not give foreign aid, not to South Africa or not to any African country on the continent. So, what could the reason possibly be for us not condemning, us as the South African government, condemning Russia as far as this war is concerned?
Well, I suppose there's two options here. One is the kind of official version, which is that we still owe Russia a debt of gratitude for their support during the anti-apartheid struggle, which certainly is true. It is true that while countries like the UK under Margaret Thatcher were basically tantamount to supporting the apartheid regime, even though there were pockets of resistance, obviously, the USSR really held the line. The USSR gave South African anti-apartheid activist military training. Putin himself was a military trainer in Africa. And they give education, various other forms of support. And it's definitely true that there are many people in the ANC and within South African society generally who feel a lot of gratitude for that support. But there are a few things here. One is that South Africa is not the only country that Russia has given support to. It also gave support to other African countries like Angola. It wrote off Cold War debt for a number of African countries. And those countries still felt okay to criticize Russia. The other thing is that the former USSR is not current day Russia. I mean, it's an obvious point, but it's true. We are talking about a communist country half a century ago. Putin's Russia is very different from what South Africa is supposed to be like on paper. We are a multi-party democracy. Putin's Russia is one in which no political dissent, virtually no opposition, is permitted. Putin's political rival is in jail. At least 9 other prominent journalists, prominent politicians have died in mysterious circumstances during Putin's reign. So on paper, at least, Russia in the current day and South Africa in the current day have very little in common, other than perhaps that they like to subscribe to a principle of anti-imperialism. Call it what you want, but the idea that the West has too much power over the world and that it's time for the developing world to take back some power. And many would agree that that's actually a good thing. But it's also not true that South Africa actually does live this out in any way. We know how much aid South Africa gets from countries like the UK and the US. We know how important those trading partners are to us. So it doesn't really follow through. Now, the other thing I should mention is that obviously it is plausible that there are reasons for the ANC supporting Russia, which we don't know about, right? We know that figures like the former president, Jacob Zuma, were very, very clear to push through a very expensive nuclear deal with Russia, for instance, which would have cost us billions for decades. Now, we don't know what other kind of deals might be going on or might have gone on under wraps during Zuma's time, for instance, but we have to ask those questions because of this unwavering support that South Africa seems so keen to give to Russia.
Finally, we do know that South Africa has money at stake in BRICS to the tune of possibly 25.5 billion. How does that, obviously, that's also a huge issue as far as South Africa not, criticizing Putin for this war on the Ukraine.
So the BRICS issue is interesting. The bloc of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, to which South Africa joined, it is supposed to be this economic focus. It's supposed to basically support each other in the global south because, then maybe countries like ours won't have to take loans from the World Bank, for instance, from the International Monetary Fund. We could make our own institutions. That's the idea. And that's why South Africa paid, it is confirmed, 25.5 billion rand in cash last year to be part of the BRICS Bank. But what have we actually gotten out of it so far? It is very, very hard to tell. And even if you look at the combined value of our trading with Russia, China, and India, those countries still only make up a fraction of what we trade with Europe. So yes, we have money in BRICS, but ultimately, is BRICS worth it for us? And the other point to be made is that BRICS has actually not met as a bloc since 2020. So the question of whether this is actually a functioning body at the moment is also up in the air.
And we could well do with 25.5 billion rands in our country to generate employment, housing, and healthcare. But that's where we leave it. Thank you indeed for your insights, Rebecca Davis, journalist at Daily Maverick. Thank you indeed. Go well. Until the next time.
Thanks for having me.
8:24 exactly, news and views right here on Salam Media. Stay with us. In a minute or two, we are crossing over to Pakistan and we're going to be talking to Arshad Yousafzai, a journalist, regarding Imran Khan, the Pakistani MP, slamming Western envoys for pressuring Pakistan to condemn the war, obviously Russia's invasion of the Ukraine.